Do superhero origin stories matter? What's crack-a-lackin', fellow home dogs? It's your old pal Channel Pup. The director of the new Batman movie, Matt Reeves, has given a few details about the upcoming Batman movie, with perhaps one of the biggest details being that the Batman will not retell Batman's origins. This is an original story which will reference the origins of the character, but it will not be an origin movie, so don't expect to see the Waynes get shot again. I, for one, am pleased to hear it. The Batman origins have been done a million times over. They've been done as a flashback, they've been done in animated form, they've been done sequentially, they've been expanded into a 5-season long TV series, we've gotten to live through it in video game form, we've seen it as a montage. It's safe to say it's done, and while Robert Pattinson may be a brand new Batman, I think we're okay for Batman Origins. We get it. I was surprised to see just how many people disagree with me though on Twitter, and it turns out that this debate is wider than just Batman, but boy did I know already. Which has sparked me to question, do origin stories matter for superheroes? Do we necessarily always have to start with the origins when introducing or reintroducing a superhero? Personally, since around about Ant-Man period in the MCU, I've been an advocate for skipping origin stories for superheroes. Every character that you see in film or experience in fiction will have formative experiences while growing up that shape them into who they are today. But do we necessarily always have to start with that? I personally would say no. And an argument I hear a lot is, what about people that are unfamiliar with these characters? If new audiences don't know why Batman is Batman, why will they invest in the character? But I think there's a lot of confusion between why Batman is Batman and how Batman is Batman. You can answer why Batman is Batman in a completely self-contained Batman story. You could reintroduce a character like Batman into a completely self-contained story, with no references to Batman's origins, and still understand why Batman is Batman. It will come across in the character regardless. He's a billionaire philanthropist who inherited his parents' company. His parents are no longer around, but what we do see is that he uses that fortune to take down criminals, and he's got a lot of anger in him. By day he is Bruce Wayne, by night he is Batman. Taking down criminals and monsters, protecting the innocent, and not because he enjoys it, but because he believes it's what he must do. He, usually, refuses to kill because he believes that all life is precious, and he never ever carries a gun. You can begin a story with Batman at that stage, and you can introduce all of those aspects without showing his parents getting bumped off, without showing what everybody's already seen before in a dozen iterations. You can take that Batman character and reintroduce him into a brand new story. Now, if say you are a very young child being introduced to Batman for the very first time, you may want to know what it is that made Batman become Batman in the first place. You might want to know about the beginnings of this character. That doesn't mean that the film didn't make any sense, and it doesn't mean that the film is incomplete as such, because the first Batman story doesn't have to include how he became Batman, and you can still get the same thrills. A character can still work and function without we, the audience, necessarily knowing absolutely everything there is to know about the character. Do you know what it was that got me into Batman? The animated movie Batman Sub-Zero. Batman is just one character in Mr. Freeze's story. Nobody in this film has an origin story told in this film. Mr. Freeze's is only touched upon. The film still worked for me as a completely standalone thing. This was what got me into Batman for the very first time. Shortly after that, I watched the 60s Batman movie. Again, no origin story. Shortly after that, Batman Forever. Again, not really an origin story. Lightly touched upon, but again, not an origin story. And I had a lot of fun growing up learning more about Batman from different versions. I spent a good few years as a Batman fan not even knowing why he didn't have parents. And to those who are saying, oh, but then you weren't a real Batman fan, I am really not interested in having that discussion, you pedantic piece of shit. If the origin story has already been told in a number of different iterations, and the new version doesn't retell the origin story, it does give curious, proactive viewers that might not know as much about the character the excuse to go back and check out previous versions. versions. It's a win-win. It means that every different version serves a different purpose. So let's say you're brand new to Batman and you're seeing the Matt Reeves Batman film and you think, gosh, that's great, I'd sure love to know more about that Batman character. Well, you can just look back at Batman 89 or Batman v Superman or Batman Begins. If the story of this film is just that Batman is investigating a series of murders, he's doing a very specific sort of mission, we don't really need to know where Batman started out as a person before. You can just develop him from here. And I think this also has a little something to do with how the landscape is changing for superhero cinema. Do you remember when superheroes in films was like a bit of a risky move? You always started with the origin story back then, and for a good reason. It wasn't because it makes no sense without it, but because origin stories can be really good stories, and they're a much easier way to get an audience unfamiliar with the character hooked. And I will still stand by that an origin story is the easiest way to get newcomers hooked in, but if your new story stands on its own 2 feet, it will be able to do it just fine as well. It just means that the writers have to be creative. I think at this point on, where we've had the Tim Burton through Joel Schumacher era of Batman, the Christopher Nolan era of Batman, and the Zack Snyder era of Batman, all of which have covered quite a lot of ground, there's no reason to keep pretending that this reboot is like the only cinematic interpretation of Batman. Something a lot of reboots tend to do is like, oh, we gotta treat this like it's a brand new thing, like it's the very first time we're seeing this character ever again. And it's just silly, this sort of attitude that everything has to be reintroduced the exact same way and you have to cover the same ground before doing anything new. It completely stifles any creativity and stifles the most early chances for the film to get an identity of its own. Like, you mean to tell me we gotta start from the same point every single time? Because Batman actors come and go really quick. Batman is prone to getting rebooted. These films don't come a dime a dozen. Pretty sure that at that rate, approximately half of the Batman movies would be origin stories. I mean, let's move over to another superhero whose recent reboot has been very popular with most people, but there's been a vocal minority of diehard fans that have an issue with the fact that it doesn't cover the origin stories again. Spider-Man. The recent Marvel Studios Spider-Man reboot has spanned across 5 movies, 2 of which he's the star of and 3 of which he's a supporting character in. This film series opted to skip the origins of Spider-Man and only touch on them very little because it's ground that previous versions of the character on film have covered. The origins of Spider-Man have been reduced down to very subtle dialogue exchanges, just to provide quick answers to any questions that one might have about Spider-Man's origins, but generally stripping away stuff that isn't relevant to the stories at hand. The reason I bring this up is because there's an area of the fan base that makes it very difficult to ever discuss these movies in a positive light when on social media. And a lot of these folks are upset because there's very little evidence of Spider-Man's origins in these new films, which they feel is integral to the character of Spider-Man. Because apparently Spider-Man is a very difficult character for anyone to understand if the origins of that character aren't spelled out loud and clear. If Uncle Ben hasn't been mentioned in scenarios where Uncle Ben isn't really relevant in these films, then that means that there's no importance for Uncle Ben, and that Uncle Ben was not a big part of Spider-Man's origins. The idea that if Uncle Ben as a subject is not relevant to any particular moment of these films, that means Uncle Ben must be completely irrelevant altogether, right? That must mean that Spider-Man just came out of nowhere then. Why is he even a superhero in the first place? The thing with Spider-Man is when you boil it down, Spider-Man is made up of 2 factors in his origins. 1, he got bit by a spider and now he has superpowers. That is explained in Spider-Man Homecoming. 2, he knows that when there's danger, he has to act. And if he doesn't, that's his responsibility. He explains this with a great deal of pain in his expression. And we see that Peter lives with his aunt, but there's no uncle on the scene. All of this takes place in Captain America Civil War. Peter references that Aunt May has been through something traumatic when his identity is revealed to Ned Leeds. The makeup and the why of Spider-Man is all there, just in a very subtle way. And I personally appreciate that it doesn't use already covered grounds as a crutch to tell us new formative stories about Spider-Man himself. I think people tend to confuse Spider-Man Homecoming as a film about Peter Parker becoming Spider-Man, when really it's a film about Spider-Man finding his place in a world already protected by other superheroes, and his desire to save the world being challenged by his lack of experience among the other superheroes. That story does not need to sit on the shoulders of a Spider-Man origin. There's more to Spider-Man than a dead uncle. And if you didn't get the references to Uncle Ben in terms of Peter's morality, it's, oh, why is he doing all this nice stuff? Why does he want to save the world? Because he's a superhero, guys. Like, we've been exposed to this concept enough by now. He does it because it's right. He does it because he's Peter Parker, and Peter Parker is a good guy. Let's not make him a slave to his origins. He's not spent his entire life on the strings of Uncle Ben. And then I've had people say, oh, but the Spider-Man series itself doesn't have Spider-Man's motivations in it. It's in Civil War only. Civil War's not a Spider-Man film, it's an MCU film. The Spider-Man films are no exception to the MCU rule. Every MCU film has answers to questions in other MCU films. Like, you wanting to watch it out of sequence and out of context from other MCU films is not the film's fault. The origins are touched on at just the right amount, and I'm kind of impressed that they didn't rely on those origins to tell the story of Spider-Man. They allowed Spider-Man as a character to speak for himself. They allowed their new stories to speak for themselves. In a story of Spider-Man stepping up and taking down a weapons dealer, you don't need to know about Uncle Ben. In a story about Spider-Man taking on Mysterio, you don't need to know what Peter Parker was like when he was 15 years old and who taught him his morality and whatnot. It's not relevant to this story. Now, obviously, I'm not just having a go at people that are upset because the film didn't cover the aspects of the character that they like the most, but I don't think it's very fair for people to so vehemently attack these films and attack those who like it and just want to discuss it in a positive light. I've generally noticed that whenever the topic of Spider-Man is brought up, there are some people that will just explode if they don't get their Iron Man Jr. joke out, which really just proves that they missed the point of a mass-market motion picture made for families. The people saying that the world and the general audience at large will be confused if Batman and Spider-Man's origins aren't explained on screen yet again, generally consider themselves to be die-hard fans, and yet they completely underestimate the global and cultural impacts of these characters. When it comes to superheroes like Batman, Superman, and Spider-Man, you don't even have to read a comic book or watch a film to know these guys' origin. It's so ingrained in our culture that you probably will have just heard it through word of mouth. There's no point in films covering the same old ground for the same old characters over and over again, when there are an abundance of characters throughout fiction and fantasy that have supernatural abilities that don't have origin stories or haven't had their origin stories told in mainstream films or media. For example, when the X-Men films came out for the first time, we didn't necessarily know the origin stories of every single member. People had no trouble relating to these characters though, because the characters could speak for themselves. Same goes for the Guardians of the Galaxy, where the origins of, say, Rocket Raccoon are implied as subtly as Spider-Man's origins are, but no one complains because the character can speak for himself. Wonder Woman was something everybody was ranting and raving about when Batman v Superman came along, but nobody was asking how she got those superpowers, because the character could speak for herself and her origins were not relevant to the story at hand. Origin stories mean a lot to me as a fan, but they don't have to be there in the films, because these films do not exist in complete isolation of every other piece of media pertaining to these characters. They don't exist in complete isolation from the comics. I and many others can make those connections and have a much richer experience because of it. Unless the film is R-rated, a whole new generation of Batman fans will be exposed to Robert Pattinson as their very first Batman, and they'll want to know more about this character because they enjoyed the film so much, they'll go and read the comics. They'll go and watch Gotham. They'll go and watch Batman Begins, Batman the Animated Series. So I think it's time to kind of drop the hang-ups about origin stories for especially cultural icons like Batman, Spider-Man, and Superman. There's more than enough that people can look to if they want extra answers. And hell, even if you do cover the origin stories, there's always going to be further questions to be asked because not everything from a comic book can be put into film. So, do origin stories still matter? As far as I'm concerned, they are not relevant to every single story that can ever be told about these characters. The origin story is a story of its own, and I don't think it's fair to expect every single version of a character to cover that same old story over and over again, and to dismiss all new stories until that's done. At the end of the day, if it comes down to it, I'm happy to just keep treasuring the origin stories in the pages of a comic book, and let films do something new. Now, if it contradicts that origin story, that's a different matter. I might have an issue there, depending on execution. What do you guys think? Comment below and discuss, and as always, if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more like it, why don't you head over to channelpup.net, where we got a blog page called Dr. Blogtopus, but as well as that, you can also buy merch, such as this awful t-shirt. But if you want to be a part of the super fun Kennel Club, why not hit subscribe, hit the like button, and in the description below, you can check out the links to my Patreon and my Twitter. I think that would be pretty sweet for both of us. What do you say, champ? But in all seriousness now, thank you so much for watching, my fellow home dogs. Have a great day. because you and I both know you've earned it. I'll catch you next time. That's a cute outfit. Did your husband give it to you? Because you could get a way better costume from Zentai Zone. Check out their range of custom-made, tailored superhero costumes. Ridiculously good quality, value, and customization. Link is in the description below, as well as my coupon code CHANNELPUP, where you can get a discount off of your purchase. And while you're at it, why not get your suit designed by my talented buddy Dan from New Blood Dan's workshop? You can contact him via the link in the description below. Seriously guys, you do not want to miss out on your chance to be your favorite superhero and feel authentic and professional. And you don't want to miss out on that Channel Pup discount.